Hello, my friends, and welcome to Quartet. So nice to have you with us here. We're coming from Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, in the Appalachian Mountains here, close to Washington and Baltimore, as we do all the time. And we're joined today for our roundtable discussion about some really big, interesting things about whether history is real or not. And we're joined by Penny Kelly. Hello, Penny Kelly. How are you?
Hi, John. Hi, Kingsley. I'm fine. I'm great. I love this topic. So,
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And Kingsley Dennis, how are you, my friend?
I'm good, thank you, John, and hello, Penny, and it's good to be back here once again.
Yeah, and sadly, Greg isn't with us today, Greg Braden, because he's had a family loss. And so he's dealing with all of that today. And so we send along our condolences. But we're happy to have you all with us, and we're glad that you come with us. We come together like this every 2 weeks, and you send us questions and comments and other such things, and we'll get to those in a moment. Today, we're going to talk about the history and whether it's true or not. But first, we've got some questions. We appreciate always the audience questions, and those of you who are with us every time. We always get some interesting and wonderful questions and comments. Kate Jones says, John, what's going on with the transition console? Last posted I was for September the 2020. Is Quartet the current version? Yes, as a matter of fact, it really has turned out to be exactly that. And that would make sense. Thank you, Kate, for that. And she asks again, she has a question for Greg. Greg mentioned that the Bible book of Revelations does not contain all of the information written by John from the Isle, not me, John from the Isle of Patmos, and that these chapters are kept in the Vatican. He mentioned he was going to follow up and see what was reported on that. Are there any updates? Penny, you might have something to say about that.
yeah, I think it's really important there are other chapters, and I don't know if Greg had a chance to follow up on that, but I just wanted to point out that the Revelations has really pretty clearly been dated to the Middle Ages. It was written as a treatise or as a warning about what was happening between I'm going to call it the Anjou people they were representing Turkey and Constantine, the city, Constantinople, I mean, and that whole Turkish, that was a huge, huge empire. And then there was what became the Habsburgs. And so that was, if you read it as a church thing, you're going to get way off track. And that's maybe a historical distortion that has been deliberate in order to make that revelation fit every single war and every single argument that we've had in the last 6, 7, 800,000 years. And so Revelations is really not about anything that has to do with church stuff or God. It has to do with the fight between those two empires, and the Habsburgs pretty much won.
You just pulled the rug from underneath the four horsemen.
I know. Yeah, the four horsemen were just four different. I mean, when you look at the astrology of what John was referring to, he was dating that treatise, that Revelations thing, perfectly to that time.
Deborah Lee says, yes, 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 but some of us need more guidelines. What should we be reading? Who should we be listening to? Kingsley Dennis, we should be listening to. He writes about this stuff.
Yeah, but I can't promote myself. That would just be
I can't. We can't.
Why not? Go ahead.
I mean, the thing is why we do this is because we give our perspectives and we're talking from our perspectives and points of view. But, what we always say is that any listener or viewer has to do their own homework. And I think that's important also. And I do remember a question which came back on one of our videos, this is related, saying, well, how does this relate to people in different circumstances from yourselves, that we have a certain, privileged circumstances. The point is that, everyone in the world has a certain position in the world and a certain life circumstances. And we're not trying to give definitive answers and say what we say applies to everybody. And that's why I'm quite, I don't really say you should read this or read that. We're all going through a different state in life and a different stage of understanding and that. And I think we're not here to give, definitive answers for every person's position in the world. And, and that's why we're here to stimulate people to do their own activities and their own research. And I think, if we can activate people and encourage them, then I think, that's we've done a good thing. But, I'm very careful about saying things specifically.
Well, even if you won't say it, we can recommend the Caleb Seth Pearl books, because I think that they're very insightful. And they seem to have come from your direction somehow. I don't know. And we'd encourage you all to put your comments and your questions, please, on the website, and we read them and look forward to them all. And we'll get to everyone that we can, that's for sure. So now it's time for our topic of today. And let me set this up by remembering that back in the late 90s, I was giving a talk in the Pentagon. The Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who was a friend of mine, who was the number 2 general who ran the whole Air Force, had invited me to come in and talk to all of his general officers in the Air Force, in the Pentagon. So there was about 35 of these, 1, 2, and 3 stars that were out here in the audience, and I was talking to them, as I usually do, about all kinds of different things about the future and what's coming downstream. And for some reason, because it's the first time it ever happened, which is why I remember it, I said, and you're all going to find out that history isn't what you thought it was, and that there's going to be a whole emergent new kind of notion about what in fact happened in the past. No, I didn't know why I said that, but what happens to me kind of regularly is that there are these ideas and these concepts that come to me that I know, because of the feeling of them, that they're really true and they're real. I couldn't have justified it or built any rationale behind it for any reason back then in the 90s. But I knew that it was going to be true. And so I've sat and watched over the years, over the 2.5 decades since then, talk how that what has started to emerge is whole different, radically different ideas about what's happened in the past. And I thought it was a timely subject, and Penny suggested this, as a matter of fact, a timely subject for us to consider, because we're sitting here surrounded by fake everything, and the information that's being presented to us is increasingly suspect, no matter where it comes from, and so on. The increased technology and the capabilities to manipulate and produce alternative realities that are almost impossible, certainly on the fly, to determine whether they're real or whether they're not. It's just proliferating like crazy. And so in that kind of a context, it seemed like it was a good time to ask the question, if everything else is fake all around us, what is history fake? And now this is really important, because all of us, whether it's explicit or not, to carry around and have embedded in us, and we are a product of who we think we are, right? We like I say, you may not go around every day thinking about what the origins are and why you think the way you think and what the contributing factors have been and so on. But the fact of the matter is that Americans are Americans because we think we have this history, and Brits are British because of all of this background that they've been taught and told, and they've got all these kings and things that we don't have over here, and that kind of influences the way they look at the world. And the same is the case everywhere. And it's more than just kind of localized. There are just these kind of fundamentals about that are transnational, about what has happened. Penny made mention about the Bible and Revelations, and there are all kinds of questions about that. As a matter of fact, there's an extraordinary book by Mauro Biglino called the Naked Bible. This is, many of you know that I grew up in a very conservative religious background. I memorized whole books of the Bible when I was in high school. It was I went to a Christian college. Everything was all based upon all the stories and the concepts and the ideas and the propositions that were inside that book. And it was there was a ongoing kind of argument about whether the King James Bible was better than the Revised Standard Bible or the New American Bible or the whatever. And but the assumptions at the base of all of this were that there's some kind of God just gave these things to us, and they were holy in some unique way, unlike anything else in the world, by the way. But then comes along Mauro Biglino, and Mauro Biglino is one of the foremost translators of the Bible, working for the Catholic Church in Rome, as a matter of fact, one of the foremost ones. And he says, well, instead of doing an interpretation, let's just read the thing the way it looks and see what the words say and see what it says. And let me tell you, this is enough to run a preacher's kid off the road. It's just wild and crazy, and but very, very compelling and convincing. And so you see that and you say, God, I mean, what in the world? You got to kind of walk yourself back and say, wait a second, if this is true, then what in the world, what do I believe? Then I come up to this book called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. This is an extraordinary little book. It's not that little, but David Graeber and David Weingau, a couple of Brits, wrote this book. They're academics. And what they make the case, just point after point after point, with a third of the book is end notes about all of the sources from here. But they say that all of our form of government and the ideas and the concepts of the form of government came from the American Indians, and that the Native Americans were in fact the guys who had all these ideas, and they'd argue with the colonialists and say, you guys are stupid. I mean, look, we don't have any problems. And the whole thing revolved around money. The Native Americans didn't have money, and the Spanish and the other ones are all consumed by the idea of money. And the natives had said, hey, look, we get along a whole lot better. We don't have any wars. We don't have any, and so on. And they build the case of how that thread works its way right into the French Revolution and some other kinds of things. And so, again, you say, wait a second, nobody told me the Indians generated all of these ideas about who we are and how we operate. And then Penny, of course, will talk more about this, but there's this Russian guy, Anatoly Flamenco, who was a statistician. He was a scientist, a statistician, a mathematician, who asked the interesting question that said, nobody's ever looked at history from a scientific point of view. Historians, of course, are not scientists. They are kind of keep telling stories from what they've heard and trying to evaluate things in increasingly sophisticated ways, but they're not scientists per se. And so he put together a group of 150 or so scientists to essentially go back and look at all of the documentation that existed about the history and try to place it in scientific terms and so on. And the bottom line is that he found out that the Catholic Church shoehorned 1,000 years into the middle of the whole story, and because they had needed to make it consistent with their theology. I mean, so you're sitting here saying, God, what else didn't they tell us about? And so that's our question today. I mean, what's the story about history and what really happened? And what's the importance and significance going forward?
I'm going to just say that back when I was 14, I read the entire Bible from cover to cover. I too was raised in a very, very religious family, and I was expected to become a nun. My father, he used to tell my grandma, don't hold your breath, none such over there. And so there was this whole religious theme. My life revolved around the garden, growing food, and religion, the seasons and the religion. So when I read that when I was 14, I was like, this thing doesn't make any sense. I read it again about 4 years later and thought the same thing. This still doesn't make any sense. And I read it again. I forget how many years after that. I was either in my 20s or early 30s. And I thought, you know what? This is the story. This is somebody's history. This is not what we think it is. And that's as far as my thinking went. And then, time goes by, I'm researching different things, and I come across the work of Anatoly Fomenko. And I'm going to add a couple of things to what you've said. Anatoly Fomenko was a kid just graduated as a mathematician from the Russian Academy of Sciences. And I did not know that mathematicians are responsible for chronology. What happened when? They are the ones, old documents are dated using the position of the sun, the moon, and the stars. And he was given these documents to date or to verify that configuration happened on this date. And mathematicians, he was also an astronomer. And so he looks at this configuration on this document and he says, well, this doesn't match. And so people say, shh, 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 be quiet. Don't just verify, just say that it matches. And he's like, what? We're mathematicians. What is this, a fiction? We're not telling stories here. And he refuses to drop it. And he gets has all kinds of trouble. He keeps on going. He decides, I'm going to take that criticism and I'm going to go back and look again. What could this possibly indicate? And so he kept doing that over that. He started when he was in his 20s. I don't know how old he is now, probably in his 60s or early 70s. But over time, he assembled that 150 scientists and astronomers and other mathematicians and historians that you brought up, John. And what he discovered was the fake history. And he wrote a series of books called the History, Fiction or Science. And there's a whole series of them. Here's book 2 in that series. And he basically shows, the whole first book is hard to read because what he's telling there is, here's my methodology. And it's like, okay, I get it. But he gets into basically saying, look, Jesus was a lot closer to us. And the real story, I think, behind the whole Jesus thing is that when you go back to some, like the female historians, like Merlin Stone, who wrote When God Was a Woman, what you see or what you discover is that there was this concept called a Jesus, and it had to do with the evolution of the human being, that human being reaching the unfolding or managing to trigger the unfolding of their consciousness and have either full or partial Kundalini experience. And those people who experienced that were then singled out in the civilization, and they were nurtured and they were groomed to be leaders and to be teachers and healers. And so the title was He's a Jesus or She's a Jesus. And it was a title for, it indicated like, okay, this is somebody you can go to if you have a problem. The church came along. There's a whole lot I'm skipping over here, but the church came along and said, we're going to turn this Jesus idea into a person. And they took the whole conflict between a guy who was the head of the Anjou Empire, and I think his name was they ended up calling him Basil or Basil the Great, Saint Basil, and they made him into the Jesus. They crucified him because he was really a prisoner of war. He lost the fight between the Habsburgs and the Anjou, the Persian Empire. And that happened in 1152 AD. And that story was taken and made into the Jesus story. And then from there, they said, well, you know, they were trying to piece together. They had the Irish monks rewrite all of the documents of history, rewrote everything to fit the Catholic or the Vatican idea of what they wanted to say, what they wanted to teach. And they kept wanting to, like, okay, well, we need to fit this in. We want to make up this story. And so they would say, okay, let's just add 500 years or 1,000 years or 800 years or whatever they needed, 300 in a few cases. And so what this team in Russia did was to unfold the whole thing and say, look, you know, the Vatican has inserted somewhere between 1,800 and 2,300 years between now and sometime in BC. And the Roman Empire was much closer to us. The whole story of Jesus is much closer to us in time. And the truth behind it is this and this and this book too. And I mentioned this one specifically because this one, he says, this is what the history books say that happened in this date. Here's the real date. And fits together the whole story of history. It turns out that the Roman kings, when they got some new accomplishment, they got a new name. And that new name then was added to the list of Roman emperors. And what we have is this list of Roman empires that goes back all this ways. And it's really the same list 3 times over. And so they've managed to expand using that list. And so that when I started reading that was probably 10 or 12 years ago, a dozen years ago. I was just blown away. And then I went on, I read a lot of history from women's history and women historians and the way they approached it. And then you read some of Timothy Freke's stuff, Freke, and he says, ain't none of it true. And then, you know, and then along comes Bellino or Paul Wallace and more of Bellino. And Bellino's very, very elegant. There's hardly any argument that you can make when you read his book. He's got all kinds of books written in Italian, but there's only 1 or 2, I think, that have been translated into English, and this is one of them. And he worked for the Vatican as a translator, and one day he said, look, you know, you guys are lying about this. It turns out there are the Bible they put out for the public, and then there's the Bible that they keep internally. And the Bible they keep internally says, well, these Elohim guys are not really God. But we don't know how to translate this. And so he ends up, I think maybe a dozen or more years ago, saying, hey, you know what? I think they're talking about ETs. They are talking about some other group of humans with advanced technology, and they may have picked this up from the Sumerians and brought this story from Sumeria. And, so then that ties in a lot of Sitchin's work, which I was like, wow, I don't think I agree with a lot of Sitchin's stuff. But then after you read Bellino, it's like, okay, now you begin to see the Egyptians, the Hebrews are not really Hebrews. They're out of Khazaria. Their DNA shows that they came from Eastern Europe, which was right by Constantinople, or Constantinople was in Eastern Europe. And they got kicked out and they're looking for a place to go and they're looking for a history. The question becomes, did they borrow Sumerian history and make it their own? It looks like they could have, but, embellished the whole thing. They embellished it to make it more real. So we have a pile of gobbledygook that is our governmental history, the dawn of everything. When I first read that, I was like, OMG, that's the one that you were mentioning, John. That's by Graeber and Wengrow. And they basically say right in the book, there was a lot of discussion. Indians were traveling back and forth to Europe. They were invited to speak at salons. They bothered to learn our language because they were like, wow, these guys don't have anything figured out and they need help. And when I read that, I was just blown away. I thought, holy cow, that is not the picture of the American Indians that I got when I was growing up. They were a bunch of savages that, knew how to hunt. They were maybe one step above hunter-gatherers. And so little by little over the past 15 years, my entire understanding of us and our history, on top of my own training before I came here, and what was the true history of planet Earth and how we became human, more human. And that you put all that together and it's like, we need to reconstruct the whole business. So there isn't a thing about the medical history, about the technological history, the governmental history, the biblical or religious history. Nothing is true. It's all made up. And when you look at the story, the censorship that's going on today, and you ask yourself, okay, what's the story going to be 100 years from now? If it's going to be all that crap that's in the mainstream media, we're lost. We need to know where we've been so we can know where we want to go.
It's clear that history is a multifaceted subject and an object. And I think the way I distinguish it is that, you see, there's history, which is what we've been talking about a lot here, is what I call fictionalisms. They're stories. And history, we're not talking about lived history and geological history. We're talking about stories that have been presented to us that are supposed to represent a story that is supposed to be true. And these are either taught to us or programmed to us or specifically represented to us to say, this is the story, this is the fiction we believe in. And at that level, of course, we're dealing with a lot of misrepresentation on a whole way. I mean, the whole history of human civilizations from before the deluge and antediluvian civilizations, and, the whole history of the human, species and the human genome. And then we're dealing with, of course, culture and social history. Now, are there fake histories? Yes, of course they are. These are misrepresentations and deliberate misrepresentations. Then I made the distinction by saying, well, there's things which happen through history, which are a matter of perception. And so to understand history really is to understand A, the perception of the person who's engaging with history, and B, the perception of the person who is transmitting the history. Now, for example, at the beginning, Penny talked about the revelation being a historical story between Constantinople, etc. But of course, a lot of esoteric science has shown that the Revelations is a very important document that reveals the stages of human evolution. So you see, a clairvoyant perspective would understand that there's a lot of kind of levels of perceptive worth in the Revelation. But on one level, you can read it as a historical document to certain degrees. And that's where you get the argument. Now, Paul Wallace and Mauro Bellini, they're representing a certain, saying the document of the Bible is incorrect. Now, of course, I would agree with that. There's a lot of incorrect inconsistencies, but these people are translators and researchers. They're not clairvoyant people or people of a psychic nature. Now, there are clairvoyant people who don't need to read history books. They know, they sense, they pierce the veil, and they understand the movements that are behind history. And that gives a different level. So I think it's important to understand that there's a frontal story which is manipulated in various degrees, but there's operations happening that maybe only a certain perceptive psychic or clairvoyant understanding can perceive. So again, let us take, Penny mentioned the figure of Jesus. Now, of course, the story is highly debatable in a linear time historical framework. But behind that, there's little doubt that through the story of Jesus, there was a hugely important intervention of a certain incarnatory energy or incarnatory intelligence that happened on this planet that was woven into the story of Jesus. Now, of course, the story of Jesus is another matter. And sometimes history is created in order as a vehicle to deliver a certain intervention. Now, this on a very simple level. I think a great example of this is through the science fiction of Frank Herbert's Dune. Now, in Frank Herbert's Dune, there was the Bene Gesserit, the sisterhood, who before Paul Atreides went to Arrakis, the Bene Gesserit spread stories about in the future would come a Muhadi Messiah to set them free. So when Paul Atreides arrived, the historical narrative was already there to fit into it. In many instances, like I think in take the personage of Jesus, a certain historical frame was set up. So when you have an intervention from a level outside of physicality, there's a physical story that can transmit this vehicle. And same way, there are people, the great saints and prophets have said, for example, the holy books have many, like the prophets have said that the Quran has 7 layers of meaning. Now, how you understand that is according to the state of the reader. So you would get a perceptive different level. Let's take this very simply. To give an example, we have the story of World War I, for example, was told to us that it started mainly because of the assassination of Duke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, and that this Bosnian Serb assassinated him, and there was started off the whole domino effect. Now you take a step back and you can say, well, these Bosnian Serbs were part of this underground kind of secret network of groupings with Masonic ties, and they were the front to assassinate Franz Ferdinand. You take that further back, and a clairvoyant would say there were occult forces who were operating through these groups, and then who were influencing on a physical level the Bosnian Serb underground to assassinate. So the level of history, the stories, goes back various levels through a physical level, the deeper physical level, which these days is called the deep state level, and then to an occult level or a psychic level, and they're all operating together. Take again the Second World War as an example. Now, the front narrative, which is highly kind of, again, mixed up and debatable, is saying this person called Hitler rose between National Socialism and, instigated the Second World War. If you go back to the deep state physical level, you understand that, Hitler was actually being influenced by the Western Axis powers, which is being talked about in Trading with the Enemy, etc. And there were these shadowy alliances on a physical level who were operating through National Socialism in Germany. If you take it back on an occult level, then the occult groups say that a great Esoteric occult force was actually in direct contact with Hitler to operate into the physical domain through these personages. So I think it's only a very physical level if we start to debate, is the chronology of history correct? We're dealing with fictionalisms. We're trying to unravel the story on a fictional level. And that has worth because we want to know, are we being duped? Are we being told a true story? But I think we need to step back from the physical level and realize that there are occult or metaphysical operations that we just can't perceive that are utilizing physical historical events to actually maneuver great events on this planet that are necessary. Now, these events may cause suffering, they may cause great upheavals and movements such as between wars and etc. But behind that, there are influences which occult schools are knowledgeable of and are operating at this level, which we are unaware of. So I think we need to be aware of that. So we're not just debating the chronology, the linear, did this story happen like this, but are there forces, symbolic meanings at a higher level, metaphysical level, that are also important and indicative at this time? So really history is actually a matter of perspective and the perception of the person transmitting it as a story and the person receiving it as a story.
So thank you both again. Very nice to have you in this delightful little afternoon conversation, evening for you, Kingsley. And we'll come back and we'll do it all again. And thank all of you and our audience for coming and being with us. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.